One of the greatest things about the internet is the way it has allowed for independent creators to share their stuff and gain their own followings. Passionate, talented creators seem to be arising all the time now, and it genuinely is wonderful to see. And one of the most famous sites that has hosted these kinds of creators is Newgrounds. Newgrounds, created on July 6, 1995 by Tom Fulp, is a site that hosts a variety of games and animations. Many of these games and animations, such as Pico, Madness Combat, and more recently stuff like Spooky Month and Ina, have become extremely famous and beloved across the World Wide Web. These properties have also developed large and dedicated followings, as basically every media property does. But of course, nowadays, Newgrounds is associated with one series in particular, a simple game with a complex legacy, a game that blew up basically overnight and created a large resurgence in attention to Newgrounds, a game that managed to crash the entirety of Newgrounds for several days. That game is Friday Night Funkin'. Friday Night Funkin', created by Ninja Muffin 99, composed by Kawaii Sprite, and illustrated and animated by Phantom Arcade and Evil Skater, is, at its core, a very basic rhythm game. You play as a guy only referred to as Boyfriend who faces off against a variety of opponents ranging from his girlfriend's parents to an actual demon, using the power of rapping. Despite the game's fun yet ultimately easy to understand gameplay and a small pool of content, the game became immensely popular in a very short period of time. It is honestly hard to describe how popular this game became in only a few months. But despite the limited amount of content, the game's fanbase continues to grow and grow and grow to the point where it has arguably become one of the biggest fan bases on the entire internet in the modern day. But, of course, no fandom is wholly positive, and Friday Night Funkin' has garnered a largely negative perception from outsiders. Some people think it's cringe, others think it's overhyped, others judge it due to stuff they have seen happen inside the fandom. But regardless, this has led to Friday Night Funkin' developing a reputation that, to put it mildly, is complicated. But I'm here to try my best to dive deep into the story of Friday Night Funkin', the history, the mods, the appeal, and why it became what it is today. Let's begin. So let's start with some history of this game. The game was originally released on October 5th, 2020 for a game jam, with an extended demo being released on November 1st, 2020. Over the next few months until April, various updates were released. But then, on April 18th, 2021, both Week 7 and the Kickstarter for the full last game released simultaneously. I mentioned previously that Friday Night Funkin' caused the entire Newgrounds site to crash for several days. Well, Week 7 was the cause of that. The traffic to Newgrounds, where Week 7 was originally exclusively released on, was so unexpectedly massive that the website couldn't handle it, which really goes to show how expansive the fandom already was by this point. And the Kickstarter that dropped the same day only added more fuel to this already blazing fire of a fandom. The Kickstarter managed to reach its minimum goal of $60,000 within only a matter of hours, and by the end of the campaign, it reached over $2 million. Unfortunately for now, that is how the story of the base game ends. The full last game is still in development, with very minimal updates as to when it will be finished. However, the fans took over to satiate the rhythm game desires of this now massive fandom, because Friday Night Funkin' has something that has given it both a sense of longevity and infamy, an absolutely insanely gigantic modding scene. Modding a game is nothing new, and many games prior have developed insanely large mod scenes. Minecraft is an easy example that comes to mind. But something about Friday Night Funkin' is different. Something about this game inspired thousands of people to make their own content for this game. Whether that be reskins, remixes, an original song, original levels, or mods with enough content to rival the current base game. Which, I guess, warrants the question, what drew so many people to this game in a short amount of time? Aside from obvious answers like the fun gameplay or catchy music, what was it about this game that inspired so many people? Well, I have a few theories. First, I think the game is designed in a way that allows for fan content, and by that I mean stuff like headcanons and alternate universes. The characters are very expressive and likable, and while it has been confirmed that more story plans to be implemented into the full last game, the current story is vague and basic. And if there's one thing fandoms love to do is apply their own ideas to their favorite characters. This lack of story accidentally created a fandom with a lot of potential for all kinds of fan and content. Be that AUs and fan stories about the events that took place before the game's story, imagining headcanons about what kind of personalities boyfriend and girlfriend had, or coming to the conclusion that Pico is boyfriend's ex. That last one eventually was confirmed by the creators of both those characters. There is also a lot of potential for crossover AUs specifically, as the base game already is a crossover. The featured opponents of weeks 2, 3, and 7 being cameo characters from other Newgrounds adjacent media. Week 2 featuring Skin and Pump from Spooky Month, Week 3 featuring Pico, the original Newgrounds mascot, and Week 7 featuring the Captain, aka Tankman, from Tankman, the character who now serves as the Newgrounds mascot. This created an opportunity for fans to imagine crossover content with other Newgrounds icons, and later all kinds of characters. But there is one thing that Friday Night Funkin' has that made it truly stand out: the Newgrounds spirit. What do I mean by this? Well, first, I want to discuss what makes Newgrounds as a website so unique. As the internet was growing around the 90s and early 2000s, Newgrounds served as a very popular hub for creatives specifically. And as the internet has evolved and social networks online became more centralized to a few specific websites, Newgrounds has remained. And I think it is largely because Newgrounds has continued to facilitate a feeling of community in the way it is designed. While there are other sites that also serve as hubs for creative people, Newgrounds is much more tight-knit. YouTube, for example, serves as a place for any kind of video you can think of, while Newgrounds was made with an artistic user base in mind. Newgrounds has a culture that it also highly inspires people to make their own content. For example, the Newgrounds holidays. The website has a variety of holidays such as Pico Day, Madness Day, and Pixel Day. The users then celebrate these days by making their own art, animations, and games. Newgrounds continues to have a culture that actively encourages creativity and a sense of collaboration, and that's what I consider to be the Newgrounds spirit. And that energy very much carries over to Friday Night Funkin'. The game really feels like a Newgrounds game. Despite the fact that the base game currently has a limited amount of content, the possibilities for what could be done with its setup are endless. And as previously mentioned, the game was designed in a way that allowed for a lot of fan content, and this was supported by the developers. That support then encouraged more people to make even more of their own fan content. Not only that, but the game was open source, meaning that fans weren't just limited to classic formats of fan content like fan art and fan fiction. It meant that if someone wanted, they could make their own levels based on their own ideas. And so they did. I guess it's about time we talk about the mods. To start, let's talk about the mod that truly started it all, or rather, the character who started it all. I am, of course, talking about Witty. While not the first mod, the Witty mod was the big turning point for the modding scene as it proved that the fandom could make their own content on the same level as the actual developers. Witty served as a blueprint for the kind of stuff the community was capable of, and many people followed in his footsteps. Soon, mods like the Carol mod versus Hex and Midfight Masses had the community completely enraptured. In a short amount of time, the mod original characters were treated with the same love and appreciation that the base game characters were. I think it helped that these characters were well designed and given interesting backstories that made it easy for fans to latch onto them. And of course, now that the floodgates were open, there was an absurd amount of people working for the opportunity to make the next big mod. This desire especially started to grow in April and May of 2021, as this was the point where the base game updates stopped, so production could begin on the full-ass game. This left the fandom for a desire for new content, so the fans took over. And as more mods came out, the quality continued to increase, which inspired more people, which made the quality increase even more. It's a cycle that just keeps getting more and more intense. This leads on to my next question. Why was there so much motivation for mods of this game specifically? Why did so many people decide to apply their original characters to this world, forever associating these characters with this community? I think outside of the already discussed elements of the game's popularity, the game is also quite easy to make a mod out of, and I don't mean that because it's open source. The levels of the game are structured in a very formulaic way, and that's not a bad thing. Each level of the base game features 3 songs against one opponent, sometimes with a slight deviation, such as Senpai's transformation at the end of his week, or Monster taking over as the opponent of weeks 2 and 5. But ultimately, the general setup of one opponent, 3 songs, sometimes additional content, created a very rudimentary setup for early mods to follow. This allowed the first handful of mods to test the waters of what could be done with the Friday Night Funkin' formula. I also think this is why Five Nights at Freddy's has a large fan game scene, as the franchise also has a very basic setup at its core. I also think it helped that the main appeal of these levels, the music, was designed in a way that's easy to compose. The songs do not have lyrics, with the singing being represented by gibberish noises similar to Animal Crossing or Splatoon. This meant most people could avoid the hassle of lyric writing. Later mods, as we will soon discuss, would become much more advanced, in some cases having as much, if not more, content of the base game. The mods over time began to truly embody the Newgrounds spirit I mentioned before. Later mods would turn into massive collaborations between a variety of programmers, artists, animators, musicians, and voice actors. It truly is impressive to see. Though, unfortunately, as previously mentioned, this story is not wholly positive. There is a lot of strife that is manifested in this community, and it would be disingenuous to ignore it. So let's talk about some issues that have arisen over time. For starters, the Kickstarter debacle. The Kickstarter happened to drop right around the time the mod scene was starting to take off, and as more and more mods began to gain popularity and the original characters associated with them became more beloved, people began to become more and more interested in the mods than the base game, which caused many people to ask the question, why donate to the Kickstarter campaign? I remember around the time the campaign was active, it was a common critique that there was no point in donating to a full game when you could just play the mods. And I will discuss later why I think this argument is actually harmful to mod creators. But ultimately, I think this perspective is unfair to the developers and their work. When you really analyze everything they plan to add to the game as well as how much time it would realistically take, it shouldn't have been surprising that they needed so much money. I mean, one of the stretch goals reached was for fully animated cutscenes, and the Kickstarter page claimed that this would entail a movie's worth of animation if you took into account how many levels they're planning. And that's not even covering the other art assets they have to make, such as character sprites and backgrounds. Koei Sprite himself has said that the art element was the part that would require the most work. There's also the online leaderboards, online multiplayer, and online sharing network they plan, which would require servers that can actually work properly. And that's only discussing a few of the stretch goals that were reached. This isn't even taking into account the fact that games are always going to be hard to make, especially with smaller teams and budgets. For example, look at Omori. According to its Kickstarter page, it was planned to come out in May of 2015. It didn't come out until December of 2020. There's also Mighty No. 9, another Kickstarter game that was supposed to come out in December of 2013, but was delayed until June of 2016. And that game was led by Keiji Inafune, an actual established name in the video game industry who previously worked on games like Mega Man. Delays are just a common factor of video game development. It shouldn't be held against the Friday Night Funkin' team or used as evidence that they're scammers. And the fact that the devs have decided to work on the game privately and not reveal much does not mean that they blew all the money on drugs. It's likely they're just doing this to prevent another issue of people leaking their progress and turning those unfinished assets into mods like with what happened with Week 8. My ultimate point is just give them time. But back to the mods, as those have been the glue holding this community together for about 2 years now. Unfortunately, over time, things have become more strained. As many of you likely know by now, drama is one of the main things this fandom is associated with, though anyone who has spent enough time in a large pool of fandoms can tell you that no fandom is without drama, and generally speaking, the larger the fandom, the more likely it is that drama will occur. But I think there is a reason as to why this fandom especially is so much interpersonal fighting, because at this point in the fandom, the fan content has essentially taken over as the main focus of the fandom. And as previously mentioned, the culture of Newgrounds is very tight-knit. And while I think that has led to a wonderful sense of community, it also means that any infighting between the mod creators is going to impact the fan base a lot more. It also does not help that many of the mod creators, composers, or artists became quite famous out of the blue. Those mod creators are all just random fans, not professionals. This only makes the situation worse. Infighting between fan creators in a fandom is nothing new, but in a situation where thousands of eyes are on these people who have been thrown into a spotlight they don't know how to handle, well, it makes sense these big projects are filled with such strife. This brings me on to my next point. I mentioned earlier that I believe the idea that a fan could just play mods instead of donating to the full-ass game was harmful to mod creators. Let me elaborate on that. Mods, at least in the early days, were just short passion projects. They were made just for fun. But when you compare mods to the full-ass game and imply the mods are on that level, or rather, should be on that level, you put the pressure on creators who never intended to deal with that pressure. And what's worse is because these mods were made initially as passion projects to be released for free on sites like Game Banana, these mod creators aren't getting any compensation. Outside of YouTube or Spotify ad revenue, these people aren't getting paid. And even then, it's not a guarantee they'll get paid through those methods because not every mod musician releases their songs on Spotify. Only the most notable ones like Saster seem to do this. This leads on to the question, at what point does it stop being worth it? At what point does the passion die and the pressure become too much? In recent months, many mods have had to deal with horrible burnout and hardships from the fandom, causing them to experience unimaginable stress, and for no pay other than appreciation from the fandom, and even then, that appreciation isn't always a guarantee. I think the best example I can think of for how this pressure can hurt the mod creators is the versus Sonic.exe mod. What happened to the versus Sonic.exe mod is a long and intricate story, but here's a little backstory. In August of 2021, a short mod based on the infamous Sonic.exe creepypasta was released. It had 3 opponents, Sonic.exe, Majin Sonic, and Lord X, and 3 songs, 1 for each opponent, and it was generally well received. Then, after one short update that added another opponent and song, that being Sunky, it was announced that a 2.0 update was dropping. Then, in November of 2021, this update was dropped, and it was absolutely incredible. To this day, I still think the quality of this update was astounding. The art and animation, the music, the clear passion and love for this project, it's amazing. And the fandom agreed. This update caused the mod's popularity to skyrocket into one of the most beloved mods in the entire fandom. And, of course, when you receive positive feedback, it inspires you to create even more. You want to hear more positive feedback so you feel motivated to work. And I'm not trying to imply that the 3.0 update was announced just for attention, but I think this positive attention might have been a contributing factor to one of the elements that would cause this update's downfall, that being how bloated the mod would become. Over time, the team would announce new plans they had for the mod, such as new characters or ideas, as well as expand the team, but as they kept announcing more and more ideas, many began to question if they could actually pull this all off, and I can't help but wonder if the excitement and collective enjoyment of the 2.0 update might have clouded the team's logic. Things only got worse as 2022 continued, because soon, around early July of 2022, it became extremely clear to the entire fandom that things were falling apart. Leaks of the content planned for 3.0 were running rampant. Many people left the project at one point or another, either due to controversy or burnout, and it was safe to say that things were not looking good. This would ultimately culminate with the announcement that the mod had been cancelled and the release of the unfinished build. Now, realistically speaking, a fan project of this scale getting cancelled is nothing new. It is extremely common for the creators of fan projects to lose interest in a fandom or become burnt out. Ask any fanfiction reader, we all have that one fic that just randomly stopped being updated. But the fall of this mod was different. And while you could argue that the people working behind the scenes, such as the mod directors, should be blamed, as according to people like Saster, there was very little teamwork in the project, I can't help but feel bad for the team. Did they potentially get a bit overzealous? Sure, I think there is an argument to be made that they tried to cram too much into one update, but I can't really blame them for getting excited about this project and wanting to rush ahead. It's a feeling I've had to deal with before as well. And even if they were responsible for the lack of cooperation, it doesn't change the fact that they didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to deal with the leaks, the drama, the fan responses, none of that. This project should not have been prioritized over the team's mental health and well-being. The mods made for Friday Night Funkin' are great. I love them dearly. And they have allowed the game to continue being relevant even 2 years after the Kickstarter. They're fun passion projects, but ultimately, that's what they should stay as. It sucks to hear that a mod you enjoy is being shelved, I get that. But when real people are struggling behind the scenes, feeling pressured to deliver something extraordinary, at a certain point, we should be okay with calling it quits. Art tends to be better when the person making it is able to go at their own pace and truly refine their work. And if someone loses interest in a mod altogether, that's okay too. These mod creators shouldn't force themselves to make these massive mods for basically nothing in return. I suppose on the topic of drama in the fandom, we should talk about something more serious. In the nearly 3 years this fandom has existed, it has gained a reputation for one thing in particular. That being the sheer amount of truly horrible and disgusting people who have worked on many mods in some capacity. There have been several cases where a notable person in the fandom has been exposed for doing some seriously heinous things. I won't be going into detail on specific individuals, but if you've been in the fandom long enough, a few names probably come to mind. This kind of stuff is admittedly hard to discuss due to the serious nature of these situations, but it is important to not ignore it at the same time. These things happened, and there's nothing anyone can do to change that, but at the end of the day, these people should not define the entire fandom. Because these people do not represent the entire fandom of potentially millions. There are countless fans of this game who are talented, amazing, and kind. Those fans do not deserve to be grouped in with those who have hurt others. This topic is tricky, and I cannot fully discuss the intricacies of these kinds of fandom issues, but all I'm saying is don't let the legacies of these awful people be what the community is remembered for. So, ultimately, the future of this game and its fan base is uncertain. We don't know when the full-ass game is releasing or how this will affect the state of the fandom. And for the foreseeable future, it appears that the mods will continue to be the main thing holding the community together. But I don't think things are entirely hopeless. I think the fandom will have a similar evolution that Undertale did, where the fan base burned hot and bright for several years with an absolutely massive fan base that was notorious, and then in later years it just cooled down to a much more chill fandom. Now, when the Friday Night Funkin' fandom will chill out, I can't exactly predict. Perhaps when the full-ass game releases, and I do believe it will be released. The fandom is far from perfect. In many ways, it's one of the most argumentative and intense fandoms I've ever been a part of, but I still keep coming back. And that's because at the end of the day, despite all the controversy and drama and cringe associated with the fandom, I still love the game. I love Friday Night Funkin'. I love its mods. I love the music. I love the characters. I love how creative and passionate the fandom became. And while there's a lot to dislike about the fandom, I absolutely have my criticisms of this fan base. There is also a lot to like. It's complicated. And that's fine. Fandoms often are complicated. They're unpredictable. I'm sure no one expected this game of all games to become what it is today, but given how absolutely massive the fan base is, it doesn't surprise me. There's not really much the fans can do about what has happened in the past other than move forward and work to make the fandom a better, safer place. But no matter what happens, I'll still always have a soft spot for this game and the mods.